Thank you, Donna, for the introduction. And I just want to say, most people probably don't know, but Donna was one of my very earliest scientific mentors. And so much of the scientific techniques I'll use today and the expertise I will hopefully be able to share with you really started with the training I received from you. So it's really special to be introduced by you for this seminar. So really happy to be here and get to share some of the work we've been doing. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right into it. You know, I think this quote from Roald Hoffmann really summarizes where the field was 25 years ago, where, you know, chemists had learned to control reactivity on low-dimensional structures, you know, molecules or linear polymers or amorphous cross-linked networks. But in multidimensional structures, we just hadn't quite got there yet. And I think that reticular chemistry largely has breached that goal. Now it's undeniable that we can make a whole host of multidimensional structures, whether this be 2D sheets that I'm going to talk about today, or 3D architectures. And having breached this goal, I think now we can move into the next phase of development, and that's what I hope to tell you about today, and share some of my thoughts and some of our findings in the Digital Lab towards that end. So for those of you who don't know, covalent organic frameworks take advantage of the same idea that MOF chemistry does, where reversible reactions allow for defect annealing. But in this case, the chemistries are all covalent instead of coordination bonds. So today I'm going to focus primarily on boronate ester chemistry, which occurs by the condensation of a boronic acid and a polyfunctional catechol. And if you're not familiar with that, this chemistry is shown here. But there are other chemistries that are amenable to COF chemistry. So there are largely two classes: shift-based chemistries that are these nitrogen-type linkages, and the boron-based chemistries. There are a few others, but largely these two classes encompass the broad majority of COF chemistries that have been explored to date. And as this boronate ester polymerization continues out, in all the examples I'll talk about today, you'll form 2D sheets that stack in the third dimension to give you a multi-dimensional object. So they're not monolayers, but I may show them as monolayers in several examples. So just keep in mind that there is a third dimension here. And I know I don't have to belabor this point to this audience, but this sort of reticular design strategy that folks use for MOFs has been fully implemented in COF chemistry now, in covalent networks, where we can rationally engineer the lattice shape and size, and we can deterministically place chemical functionality with respect to one another. And that's obviously a powerful design strategy for many materials that have a wide range of potential applications. So today I hope to tell you a little bit about how understanding the chemistry can get us to some of these more property guided studies. Okay, so a few years ago, all COFs essentially were synthesized as polycrystalline powders. There are a few examples that would buck that trend. There are some polycrystalline films, but largely the polycrystalline powders were the primary morphology that was obtained in all syntheses. And that is fundamentally limiting, because if we can only synthesize polycrystalline powders, one, they're challenging to investigate from a property standpoint, they're challenging to fabricate in devices, and also the domain sizes that we were obtaining in polycrystalline powders were quite small and defect prone. So beyond the fact that they're challenging to study and integrate into device architectures, they're also not quite representative of the bulk material we intended to synthesize. So my colleague Brian Smith, who was a former postdoc in the Dictel group, noticed, just as I was joining the group, that if you include nitrile co-solvents in the reaction of boronate ester 2D COFs, you actually avoid this precipitation event. And that is really enabling, because in earlier studies, we had found that this precipitation event largely limited the crystallite growth and the extension of the lattice. You can think about that as, the heterogeneous problem. When crystallites start to aggregate, they're more challenging to grow. So this got us away from that fundamental kinetic trap, essentially. And this is sort of where I come into the story, but I think that this was a very important observation early on, that you know, just because things weren't crashing out, the material we intended to make was still, you know, present in the solution. And we can do all of the standard characterization we do on polycrystalline aggregates, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. You know, you can look at the X-ray diffraction pattern, see the expected peaks. We can isolate these colloids via centrifugation and check their surface area. They have, you know, very conventional type 4 isotherms with high surface areas and sharp pore size distributions. And we can look at the particle size in situ using techniques like dynamic light scattering, or ex situ using things like TEM. And in both cases, you'll find that the domain size is about 50 nanometers. But the TEM shows you that these are largely single crystalline. Though they're very small, though I'll point out that the size of these particles is actually commiserate with the size that most folks were obtaining in their polycrystalline aggregates via some Scherer analysis or some X-ray diffraction interpretation. So it seems like this size is, you know, pretty consistent with what we would have obtained in a polycrystalline powder, but now they're stabilized as single crystals. And this inspired us to think, well, is this because we've gotten away from the kinetic trap of aggregation, now can we grow these crystallites further? And we thought, well, one simple way to do that might just be to introduce more monomer. And from our earliest experiments, we started to infer, and you know, we had this sense that perhaps we would need to choose one type of regime where we could either favor nucleation or growth, because there's nothing stopping new species from being nucleated. And so I'm going to kind of gloss over a lot of the technical details here so I can get to the more application relevant studies. But I think that the ability to selectively tune which process is operative is, you know, key here. So I want to go into just a little bit of the data on that. This all started really with my colleague Haoyun Lee, who's a research scientist now at the University of Arizona, and he did kinetic Monte Carlo simulations to examine this growth and nucleation behavior. And on the top, the experiment he essentially does is puts a bunch of monomers in a box, and he's parameterized all of their different reactivities, you know, whether that's bond breaking, bond forming, interlayer stacking, and those are things we can examine experimentally ex situ individually. And then you just let that simulation stochastically evolve. And what he finds is that if he doubles the monomer concentration, the rate of nucleation more than doubles. It's a nonlinear process. That's in contrast to growth in either direction, where if you double the monomer concentration with a seed particle that's present, the growth is actually quite linear. It's a first order process. And this inspired us to develop some experiments at Argonne National Lab using synchrotron diffraction to look at the rates of, you know, Sachs features coming in, which is a bit more challenging to interpret quickly on a slide, so I've omitted that. But by comparing the Sachs data to the wide angle scattering, where you can see Bragg diffraction peaks, you can actually determine what the growth rate is of that 100 peak with relation to the Sachs data. And taking those two things together, what we find is that if we double the monomer concentration, the rate more than doubles. We see a nonlinear dependence. And that's in contrast to the situation where if we had included pre-existing seeds and doubled the monomer concentration, in that case, we find that the growth seems to be first order. So that if you double the concentration, the rate doubles. And this is a really important finding because what it tells you is that the growth in this case, the growth and nucleation behavior, isn't guided by surface energies or other things that folks typically think about with nanocrystalline precipitation and growth. Instead, here we're governed strictly by the fundamental organic chemistry rate laws that are operative in both cases. So for example, just as a simple thought experiment, there is no situation in which a nucleation event cannot result from two things coming together. And so the nucleation event is inherently higher order. Whereas in the growth case, one of those reactants is fixed. It's the number of, you know, crystalline nuclei. It's the number of crystalline seeds. And so, you know, that's sort of a simple way to think about why we see this first versus second order dependence. And it gives some rationales into how to design more efficient polymerization strategies. I'm not going to go into that today, but I think this is a really important finding. So I just wanted to make sure we got to that. But I think the most compelling evidence here is the TEM of these grown particles. So after growth, we can still look at the TEM, and you'll see these particles are quite a bit larger than the ones we started with. And so the growth that we hope to encourage seems to have happened. And really exciting, you can look at the lattice fringes of a single particle, and they actually extend from one side all the way to the other. And that gives very good evidence that the particles started as single crystals and then grew as single crystals as well. And, you know, we found quickly after that that this strategy seems to work for, one, a lot of boronate ester-based 2D COFs, but also seems to work for other families of BO type chemistries. So this is a baroxene, it's a 6-member BO linkage. And essentially the same strategies we use to form boronate esters seem to generalize here as well. And being able to have colloidally stable suspensions where you have a solution processable form of nanocrystallites is really powerful for a lot of fundamental investigations. For example, a lot of spectroscopies benefit from having stable solutions. And just quickly, you know, my colleague Nate Flanders, who's a joint between the Chen and Dichtel groups at Northwestern, has been looking at different particle sizes and the exciton diffusion lengths in them. And it seems like the 50 nanometer crystallites that are isolated in the polycrystalline powder form are too small to really investigate the fundamental exciton diffusion length in that case, because you have exciton annihilation. So for example, if you want to build highly efficient solar cells, you're going to want larger crystalline domains of your particular COF. And then working with Alexandra Brumberg, we've looked at a lot of through space electronic interactions that arise as a function of the van der Waals contact between two sheets. So for example, we can take these diacetylene units and compress them to really close contact, and that leads to a major enhancement in fluorescence. And similar things can be observed with other chromophores. You know, this is a excimer type emission that arises from pyrene aggregation. And I think these fundamental investigations are key to determining the appropriate application space for different types of 2D frameworks. And I think this is an exciting way to be able to study that in a systematic way. But really, the colloidal suspensions themselves are not really amenable to devices, at least not directly, because it's hard to imagine a device geometry where a piece of that component is going to be a liquid, right? But going back a few years, the Dichtel lab had realized that if you immerse a flat substrate that can have van der Waals contact with the 2D COF, the COF will actually form a nice film on this templating substrate. So that could be graphene, MOS2, lots of other, you know, two-dimensional materials that have these high amounts of van der Waals contact with our 2D polymers that we're going to make here. But in those cases, something that was fundamentally limiting for us was that the films we made were contaminated by powders that precipitated simultaneously in the synthesis. So for example, you know, if you have a small amount of powder and it creates a pinhole defect and then you try to deposit an electronic contact, well, you're going to get shorting. And those sorts of things made it really challenging to reliably build devices using that type of approach. But we realized, well, we have an approach now, a synthetic method, that's going to prevent that powder aggregation and that powder contamination on your film. And so we've been exploring using the colloidal syntheses to nucleate and then grow COF films directly onto these templating substrates. And because the substrates because the films formed on these substrates are not contaminated, it's possible to do multi-series growth. So we can systematically increase the thickness of these materials. And that's reminiscent of the growth strategy we used before, and is really powerful as a design strategy to get films of appropriate thicknesses for different types of devices, which is always an important parameter. Quickly, I'll just show you some data that these films are very, very smooth and, you know, have a very well-defined thickness. And you can also tell based on the grazing incidence diffraction pattern here, based on the concerted intensities along the different axes, that these are well-oriented films, so they are laying normal to the surface. So essentially they've conformally coated, the graphene layer that sits underneath them. And I don't know if you'll remember, but back to my earliest slide, folks have speculated that anisotropic optical behavior should arise as a function of the perpendicular transition dipoles in these different materials. And indeed, we can observe that using polarized fluorescence. And I think this is a really neat measurement because it corroborates the highly oriented nature we observe by grazing incidence diffraction. Interestingly, if you attempt to do this on films that were grown via our old method where we had the small amount of powder contamination, that small amount of powder contamination really complicates the anisotropic optical behavior because the unoriented crystallites on the top seem to contribute more than the whole film itself. Okay, so this seems like a promising method to make oriented, really nicely defined films on a variety of substrates. And having been able to accomplish that goal, we were really interested in building electronic devices out of these materials. That's been an interest for a very long time. But if you look at the electronic structure diagram here, what you'll find is that these are highly insulating. I mean, the band gap is enormous. And largely that arises from the fact that the boronate ester linkage is not conjugated at all. And so your in-plane electronic conductivities are going to be low in that case. But actually, they still have interesting electronic properties, even in the absence of being conductive. So as a function of their high porosities and the fact that they don't include any polarizable bonds, I mean, metal coordination bonds are a bit more susceptible to that side of things. But when you have a fully organic network with a high level of porosity, the dielectric constants are quite low. So I've included some calculations from our colleagues in the Breda group where they've essentially found that all of these COFs, it's a variety of COF structures, are well below the low K dielectric target in all of their crystallographic vectors. So that's kind of an interesting property to investigate. And it's one that is relevant in devices, especially in atomically flat materials. So we decided to look into this experimentally and sort of inspired by those calculations. And what you can do is you can deposit gold pads on top of this film, and you'll find that the leakage current is quite low across many devices. That's indicative that the film is highly uniform with no micro scale defects that's going to lead to shorting. I mean, you can see these pads are on the macro scale, hundreds of microns. So that's pretty good. And then you can look at the voltage capacitive response, and you can do some AC spectroscopies, and you can extract out from those measurements that the dielectric constant is indeed quite low, 1.6, which just interestingly is pretty close to a linear combination of the dielectric vectors I showed on the past slide. So this was done by Professor Mark Hersom and Professor Sengwan at Northwestern, and this was a really exciting measurement for us because it sort of validates that this strategy we use to generate these highly uniform films have some technological relevance. This is sort of taking things to the next level, in my opinion. And in tandem with this, sort of independently, we were interested in just examining the fundamental properties of these materials, which we can do more easily on films than we can in polycrystalline aggregates, like I've already said. And so our colleagues, Professor Hopkins and Professor Geary, were looking at the thermal conductivity of these materials in comparison to other organics and other 2D materials. And what they found using a combination of time-resolved spectroscopies and molecular dynamic simulations is that COFs are far more thermally conductive than other organic materials. And that largely arises from the fact that they are highly crystalline and covalently linked across extended length scales. So for example, C60 fullerenes are quite thermally conductive for organics because they're very crystalline, but they still fall short of COFs because they're not covalently linked in all dimensions. And also, just as an interesting note, the thermal conductivities are anisotropic as a function of the anisotropic structure. So, and this sort of got us thinking that this is kind of a unique combination of properties, right? For organic circuits, silicon-based technologies in general, but also organic electronics, thermal management is highly important. And so if you have combinations of interesting dielectric properties with high performance thermal properties, that's sort of a unique design space that's challenging to access with other materials. So here are some other common low K dielectrics, and you know, the semiconductor industry is highly interested in these for a variety of different interconnect shieldings and things like that. So this is, I think, just an interesting example that new materials are inherently going to lead to new combinations of properties, which has been predicted for a long time. And I think we're finally approaching the time in COF chemistry, at least, where we can really observe that. And more broadly, I think that this combination of properties is certainly not going to be the only one that's unique to layered 2D polymers. And I'm excited to see what other unique combinations arise in the coming years. Okay, so I also wanted to give an example that perhaps is a little bit more industrially relevant. I think the direct growth methods, which are prevalent in the COF literature, I think that those are important on the lab scale, undoubtedly. But they suffer from some practical issues if you want to build COF devices at scale and on virtually any substrate. So for example, if you have to do direct growth, your substrate inherently has to be stable to whatever the growth conditions are, which are sometimes quite extreme. So we realized, though, that having created colloidal suspensions of covalent organic frameworks, what we've really done is created a solution processable form of those materials for the first time. And so that led us to essentially taking these colloidally stable inks and just depositing them using a spray coating technique over a shadow mask to deposit, you know, patterned arrays. And this is a highly industrially relevant technique. You can scale it quite easily. And you can think about this sort of like spray coating a car. You know, if you want to paint a car, this is essentially how you would do it. Actually, the setup we use is a commercial airbrush, which is used for that kind of thing. So as I already told you, we can create prints of virtually any size. So this large print is, you know, sizable, definitely larger than my hands. The high resolution prints have tight line thicknesses on the order of a few microns, and we can print arrays of those really rapidly. And beyond, you know, just arrays of squares, we can also print, you know, nice circles on a device, which I'm going to talk about more in a minute. And we can also print, you know, patterned words and other things like that, all using a shadow mask. And I'll tell you that all of these prints were done in under 5 minutes. So once we have the inks, we can just directly deposit them into virtually any configuration on virtually any substrate. And I don't think this approach is unique to COFs, and you know, folks are looking at this for metal organic frameworks. And I think this is a really interesting approach to the fabrication of devices based on these materials, which I think in all cases will require at least new strategies that, you know, are not necessarily typical for other polymeric type materials. Okay, so because we could deposit the material in a specific space, into a specific device geometry, what we decided to do was deposit the COF as an active material on a QCM wafer. And this is known as acoustic sensing, because essentially how it's going to work is that active material is going to absorb some species. The resonant frequency of the quartz crystalline microbalance underneath is going to change, and using the Sauer-Bray equation, which I've shown in the graph on the right, is we can extract the mass or the amount of material that's been absorbed to the COF active layer. In this case, I'll point out that the amount of COF we've deposited is on the order of a microgram, or on the order of a milligram. And so we're talking like pennies worth of COF on the QCM wafer. So this is a really efficient use of a high surface area active material. And what you'll notice is that, you know, nonpolar substrates, nonpolar analytes, seem to not absorb so well to the COF. There is a response, but it's not overwhelming. But as you get to more polar analytes, those seem to absorb quite a bit more strongly. And then you'll probably notice that one of these analytes definitely does not look like the other. So this is cadaverine, which is a bifunctional amine. And largely amine sensing is important in food processing and food transport, because you need a method to detect food spoilage before it ruins the entire batch and isolate whatever materials are causing the rest of them to go bad. So this is an important sensing challenge that a lot of folks are working on, independent of coughs. But this kind of inspired us to look more deeply into amine sensing generally. And this cadaverine adsorption really, really confused us at first, but then we started thinking, well, maybe this cadaverine is binding differently than the other materials. And so my computational colleague, Matthew Ryder, who's now at Oak Ridge National Lab, looked into this using DFT and sort of validated what you might imagine just sort of ad hoc, that perhaps this cadaverine is just the right length to bridge two boron sites. And indeed, we actually can see that in DFT, and as another set of circumstantial evidence, we don't see this unusual binding profile when we use pores with, or coughs with larger pores, larger separations between the boron sites. And I think that's a really unique thing, and that's very interesting because it points to a more exciting possibility that if there is an analyte of interest, perhaps you can take advantage of the systematic placement of chemical functionality to develop highly sensitive and highly selective sensors, whether that be in an acoustic platform or others. So I think that's sort of a frontier in chemical sensing using framework materials that should be explored in more depth. Okay, but having realized we had something that was highly sensitive as an amine sensor, we decided to look into trimethylamine, which is a very volatile byproduct of food decay. And you'll see that we have a linear response down to the part per billion limit. So we have a limit of quantification in the part per billion range. And I can see I'm almost out of time, so I'll just go to my conclusions and say that, I think my main takeaway of what needs to be done next is that really we need developments in all of these areas. We need mechanistic understanding, we need new synthetic methods, and once those are developed, we'll be able to go on to examine more properties, and eventually those properties will lead to technological implementation. That's at least my dream. Before I go, I want to say that I am a co-host of the upcoming Gordon Conference on nanoporous materials, which will be held in fall of 2021. I really hope to see you all there. And if you're interested in talking more about it, my email is here, and Jeff Reimer, who is organizing the GRC components, email is here as well. We do have some travel funding available, so if that's of interest to you, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And briefly, I just want to thank Professor Will Dichtel, who's been a phenomenal mentor to me. And I'm really lucky to have worked with him and the amazing team he's assembled. And outside the Dichtel group, we have just an amazing group of collaborators who've pushed the science further than I ever could have by myself. And I think that that's led to a lot of really interesting developments. And thank you all for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions if there are any.